Hello and welcome to What's Your Story? I'm your host, Dr. Lisa Schuster, and I'm really excited to introduce you to my guest. He is professional horticulturalist Benjamin Carroll. It is a pleasure, and you've got a lot of things here that you're going to show us.
So we've got a lot to cover.
Yes.
Should we just get started?
Absolutely.
Okay, good. I actually brought in a couple of examples of some shrubs that you can actually use for forcing, and if you're at all like me, you want to see some blooms at this time of the year, a very transitional season. But there's some shrubs that are really early bloomers that you can actually cut and bring them into the house and kind of force them on and convince them to think that it's springtime and ready to bloom a little bit earlier than they normally do. It's really easy. Sometimes you're out cutting your shrubs just to give them shape, and this is a good time of the year to do it because it's before they actually start to bloom. So you'll be out cutting your shrubs and shaping them, maybe thinning them. But something like this, which is the Nanking cherry, is actually a good shrub to use for forcing flowers. And really, you can see each one of these green buds is going to be a beautiful light pink flower, just beautiful, and definitely something you want to see in the springtime. And it's just as easy as that. All you have to do is cut the shrub and take it inside and put it into a bucket of warm water, and you can force them on. And all you really need to do is have a bucket with warm water, put the shrubs that you cut into the bucket and let them soak in a bright situation, and then they'll start to bloom. And you can see there's a couple of examples I have here, like this fragrant viburnum, which is really light pink. And this one actually, all of these I cut a week ago to give you an idea about how quickly it can happen. And this one's actually already going over, and it smells really nice, and you can see why it's called fragrant viburnum.
Nice and light.
Lovely and springy, yeah.
Okay, so now we're going to be doing bulbs, and I usually think of bulbs for the autumn, for the fall, but this is for the spring. Tell us what the difference is.
Yeah, you're right. Most bulbs you actually plant in the autumn, and then they overwinter, and then they come up and they push out some growth and some flowers in the springtime. But those are hardy bulbs, and they can handle being in the Evanston cold temperatures that we get here in the winter. But there are some bulbs that come from subtropical regions like dahlias, and dahlias are bulbs that come from areas that don't get frozen over the winter. So those are bulbs that we need to start thinking about planting at this time of the year. They're really not true bulbs. They're like tubers, and you can kind of see why. More like our potatoes, what we would eat instead. The energy is stored in these tubers in this dahlia. You want the neck of the old stem to be just at the surface, almost where it was last year when it was growing in the ground. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill this up with potting mix, and then we're going to give it a good drink, and then put it again in a place that's nice and warm and also bright so that it gets the message that it's time to grow. And then it'll start to push out lots of new growth, and once it gets big enough, it'll start pushing roots into the pot. So by springtime, we can just take the whole plant out of the pot and plant it in the garden, and it's ready to go. So the next thing I'd like to show you is how to start some seeds, to germinate some seeds. And spring is really the best time of the year to do that. Of course, everybody's thinking about it. And so starting with a seed pack or a cell pack is really nice because you don't have to use a lot of soil. And now you can see that there are each individual cell. If you kind of rub your hand over it, you can identify where each individual cell is. And then what we need to do is just put each seed into each cell. And it's quite easy to do. And it depends on the size of the seed, because sometimes seeds are really big and sometimes they can be quite small. And I'm just taking a seed and just putting it in the middle of the cell, and then just giving it a little bit of a push.
Okay.
All right? And then
you would do all of them.
You're going to do all the cells, exactly, and give them a drink. And I won't do that here because you've got the tablecloth. But give it a nice watering in, make sure it's nicely and evenly moist. And again, this is going to go into an area that's got lots of sunlight, that's warm, and then just make sure that you're keeping it damp, not overly wet because the seeds can rot off, but make sure that it's nice and evenly moist until you start to see some germination. Next thing I'd like to show you is the how to do wheatgrass. The seeds are so easy to germinate. This container here, the one I'm showing you, with the living grass in it right now. This I started a week ago today. That's 1 week's growth. Isn't that crazy? And it's so easy to do. Again, putting some soil, some potting mix into a pot, making sure that the soil surface is level. And then I just went to the Whole Foods and I got wheat berries, and they're just like this. And you can get them for cooking, but these are ready to germinate. They're real wheat berries ready to go. Make sure that you don't get the ones that are cracked, or the ones that are cut, because they won't germinate. You need to get the whole wheat berries. And then just very densely put them onto, actually maybe you can hold that there. And
It's really like making like a coating.
Exactly, because you really want it to be really, really dense. And if you don't do it dense enough, it just looks spotty. It's not very pretty. It looks kind of a little bit weedy. But if you do them really dense, something like that kind of density. And I just want to take a little bit of soil and just lightly cover them.
Okay.
And what that does is to make sure that the compost or the potting mix is providing moisture for each one of the berries, the wheat berries. And then give it a drink. And I like to cover it with plastic in a plastic bag for 2 days, uncover it after 2 days, and then just start to watch them grow. And in no time, you get beautiful, springy, fresh, green grass.
That's really cool. Now every time I'm at Whole Foods or at the health food store and I see what you would use for cooking, I know that you can actually plant them.
Yeah.
All right, so now we're going to talk about roses. What do you have for us here?
Right, I brought in for you today what's called a bare root rose, and this is a bare root knockout rose.
And what's so great about this knockout rose?
Knockout roses. Knockout roses are great because they really are relatively disease-free. These are repeat blooming roses, so they're going to bloom throughout the season, and they don't need to have a lot of chemicals in order to make sure that they're healthy. They're really pretty disease-resistant, which is great. Now, you do want to make sure that you're looking out for a couple of things before you actually plant the rose. One is that you want to make sure that there's no rotten roots, so just kind of pick around and see, and you can see if you touch those, you can see that they're kind of firm. They don't feel soft and soggy. So those are healthy roots, and they all look healthy to me, so we don't really need to prune any of those away. But on the top you can see here that there's been a couple of branches that have been damaged just from being knocked around. See, it's broken. And really that probably won't do very well. Here's another one. Look at that, totally broken. So what you need to do is you just need to make sure that you cut those away, past the broken part, and discard it. So that's pretty much all the broken branches cleaned up, and that's great. Now the next thing you want to think about is the bud you're going to cut it back to. The rose will start to push out buds, and you can see those are going to become the new stems, and they don't just come from one side of the stem, they come from all around the stem. The smart thing to do, or the correct thing to do, is to choose a bud that's actually facing out. Even though, for example, this bud, you can see is higher, and you think, well, that's good because I'll have two branching stems, but really, this one is growing into the rose, or into the shrub.
So when you mean out away?
Away from the
perimeter.
plant, exactly.
Okay.
Otherwise, they just get all tangled in between as they grow.
So there's one little one right here. I don't know if you can see it, but that's where he's going to cut, just
That's
above
where I'm
that.
going to cut to. And now this I'm just going to cut on a slight angle and not too close to the bud. Just like that. And again, here you can just look around the plant and see if you can find some. This is probably okay because there's no stem coming from this side, and that's a good fresh bud. Let's leave that one there.
Okay.
Okay? And you just work your way around and choose all the buds that you want that are out facing. Now, before you actually put it in the ground, you want to make sure you give it a good soak. Even though it's been in some moist soil or moist soily kind of stuff, you want to make sure you put it into just relatively warm but not hot water and let it soak in a bucket for overnight, or at least 8 hours. So you do it the night before, and then the next day you're going to get it into the ground.
Okay, so now you're going to show us how to do a spring container, spring flowers.
Yeah. So it's really easy to do as well. You just need to take a pot.
Okay,
and
filled with soil.
Filled with soil, right. And then you're just going to try to think about maybe planting it up with a bit of aesthetic interest. So maybe the first thing you want to put in might be something that will trail over the edge. In this case, it's an ivy. And again, ivies are pretty hardy, so they can handle it. But that might be something you want to put in towards what would be the front, visually, of the container.
All right.
And then work your way around things that maybe aren't quite as tall. And you can take a purple violet there, or viola, or pansy.
It's pansy, so I'm going to put that right next to...
And that's going to go next to it.
All right, and I'm going to have this so it's facing out.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the flowers don't always last an awfully long time, but as they fade, you can pinch them off, and that encourages new blooms to come, and they'll keep blooming for a while.
Okay.
And then you can also think about maybe something like this thrift, which has a very interesting texture as well. So you can see we've got some bold leaves. We have some color from the flowers.
This is very spiny.
Yeah, spiny and grassy. It almost looks like grass, but then it's got the beautiful pink flower, and so that will put maybe closer towards the back.
And again, you're not really putting it really too deep.
Right, exactly. The plant is
like
growing
halfway.
Yeah, the plant is growing at a level that it wants to grow at, and that's the level that it's at in the container, and that's why it looks so well now. Just make sure you're not planting it any deeper than the level of the plant in the container. So you don't want to put it deeper than the level it's actually at the moment. And then we'll pop that in over here. And you can see right now, already you're starting to get quite a bit of interest. So you got some white, some pink, some yellow, some purple, and then a bit of the green, which won't have any flower at all, but does have interest because it kind of spills out over the edge.
And the other thing that I want people to know is that these pots, Benjamin Carroll is also an amazing potter. So he makes all these pots, and you can actually purchase them if you go online to his Benjamin Carroll website. So that's pretty exciting that you can get a pot that's made by him. So now we have what are called kokedama. Why don't you tell us about this? I've never heard of it before.
I know, they're really actually very interesting. Kokedama is a Japanese word. It's actually two words, koki, which means moss, and dama, which means ball. So it's a moss ball, and you can see why we call it a moss ball, because it's actually a plant that's growing in a ball covered with moss. It's also called poor man's bonsai, because bonsai really can be very expensive and take a long time to get to have the effects that you want. But this is just a really cheap and cheerful way to have something that's simple and beautiful and elegant. So they call it poor man's bonsai as well, which is kind of nice. And you don't have to have ivy or even anything green. In Japan, they will sometimes use strawberry plant, and so you have a flower, or you can have a kind of more of a ferny foliage. You can do ferns. Anything you really think is something that might look beautiful, usually as a standalone plant. On my website, I actually offer a Dracaena, which is this plant here with the red edges, as a moss ball or a kokedama. So you can imagine this in a ball of moss, and it does really look beautiful.
So when you say you offer it, you mean that a person can go and they can actually, they don't make it themselves, you make it for them, and then you send it.
And I send it to their home.
To their home.
It makes a nice gift.
You're obviously passionate about what you're doing. It's quite obvious by everything that you've shown us, and I hope all of you are excited as well. Have a fun time, perhaps planting on your own during the spring season. And remember, always do what you love. Until next time, I'm your host, Dr. Lisa Schuster, for What's Your Story?